Empires and great powers rise and fall. Sometimes the fall of one empire has unintended consequences and gives rise to another empire. One prime example of this pattern in history is the Napoleonic Wars and how it laid the seeds of the German unification. But this war also indirectly resulted in the rise of the British Empire. Now, prior to the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had global ambitions, but its defeat in North America brought the empire to an internal decline, and the other European navies severely restricted any further British expansions. Then came Napoleon, and in his first military phase, his French navy wiped out all the other European navies. However, later in the war, the French navy was defeated at the Battle of Trafalgar by the British, and finally, the French army was defeated at Waterloo. In short, Napoleon had just devastated continental Europe, wiped out all the navies, and finally, the French Empire collapsed. The only navy to survive the Napoleonic Wars was the British, and they quickly moved to dominate the North Atlantic Ocean and the trading routes into India and the Pacific Oceans. But Britain did not just emerge as a naval power. The leadership of the country used the economic opportunities of trade, and they emerged as the leader in the Industrial Revolution. So the unintended consequence of the Napoleonic Wars was the rise of the British Empire. Now, Britain's power lasted undisputed for several generations. That is, until another unintended consequence led to the replacement of Britain by another country. As a manufacturer, Britain needed raw materials from abroad, and so they acquired new protectorates and established strategic supply stations throughout the world to ensure the security of the trading routes. It was an empire that had clearly overextended itself and was carrying huge burdens. But also it was an empire that unified the world by trade. It was this economic foundation that came under threat with the German unification in 1871. Once unified, Germany transformed the world as it became the most dynamic economy in Europe. The Germans were underselling British goods with their more efficient production. The other threat to the economic dominance of Britain came from the United States, which was also industrializing at a record-breaking pace. In reality, the industrialization of the US was heavily influenced by British investors who made bigger profits in the US than back at home. The US industrial base established a navy that rivaled the British Navy in early 20th century, so the British were facing two other rising powers on opposite sides. It did not take long for the eruption of a new massive war. World War I devastated Europe, including the British. Nations were destroyed, whole generations were lost. This was the cost of war, and it was a huge burden on the economic base of Britain. And yet the First World War really didn't solve anything. In fact, it laid the seeds for the Second World War, because the German question was not solved, and the US emerged even stronger than before, and by the time the Second World War had ended, Britain had lost its empire. But this wasn't something that was apparent immediately after the war. The British Empire remained intact, but Britain was essentially bankrupt and was unable to hold on to its overseas holdings. So the country started to withdraw from key locations that it had struggled acquiring for centuries. Basically, in the 6 years that the war lasted, the British had lost 2 centuries of expansionism and conquests. But it wasn't the Germans who had defeated the British, it was the Americans. You see, US assistance to Britain was based on Washington's own interests. The Americans saved the British from being forced into accommodation with the Germans, only to force Britain to accommodation with the US. So the balance of power completely shifted towards the United States. But the British did not really understand or accept the collapse of their empire. It took a major international crisis to occur for the British to finally realize what they had lost. The first crisis was the independence of Pakistan and India in 1947. The British were unable to act and made tremendous concessions. This event was followed by the Suez Canal crisis in Egypt in 1956. But this time the British, with the aid of the French, were willing to act. However, the US politically intervened against the British, and this really marked a turning point in British history, because it was a clear wake-up call. Their empire was no more. It was the US that was calling the shots now. So the British essentially withdrew to the British Isles. The fall of the British Empire shows us just how quickly things can change. In 1939, Britain controlled 1/4 of the world and 1/5 of the world's total population. 5 years later, the empire had collapsed and the country withdrew to the British Isles, and even there it was facing insurgency in Northern Ireland. This all shows us just how quickly a global power can get caught off guard if it continues to overextend its military power and neglect its financial decline. The British also showed us how unintended consequences can lead to the demise of one country and the rise of another country. This was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. Take care and Saul.